barriers to implementation. And, there are going to be a number of barriers. And that impacts on timeframes. So, I know this is a 5-year plan. We think it's going to take, properly speaking, 2 to 3 years to actually get detailed project preparation, capacity development, and addressing barriers to implementation. And that's only going to leave you a couple of years before the expiry of the term to have actually implemented the full JET IP. So we suggest that, we need to take a longer term perspective around implementation. We floated the idea of a second 5-year phase of implementation, which we think would really be what you properly require to achieve the full energy transition. Then, moving forward, we do think stakeholder buy-in, we've now consulted extensively with stakeholders. There's a clear commitment to stakeholder engagement on behalf of the JET IP team and the PMU. And we recommend that, stakeholder engagement continues, even as we move to a sort of inclusive, participatory partnership approach around implementation. And, there's an enormous well of goodwill and capacity that exists across the various stakeholders for implementation. Lastly, sorry, I've rabbited on the adaptation side, we do need to note that we're in a period of rapidly accelerating climate change. Adaptation impacts are going to have very serious implications for the energy transition, not least for, for instance, water linked to the power sector. And we think that you've got to think a little bit more carefully around how to mitigate climate impacts and risk. But more importantly, there's been a historical underinvestment in adaptation and resilience. And we make a strong recommendation that the JET IP needs to be followed by an adaptation and resilience investment plan. This is significant, not just, domestically, but also globally. There's this growing focus on adaptation. There was agreement on a loss and damage fund at the last COP. That's going to be a big focus at COP28. And I must say we're enormously encouraged when we saw that the NDC partnership has just put out a request for proposals around developing such a plan. So we're reinforcing that initiative by government. So that's it from my side, Deepak. I wonder if we could maybe prevail on Rudy to just make a few comments. I mean, I don't expect him to reply to what we're recommending, but, maybe just if we could hear his dulcet tones and he could reflect a little bit about how they're thinking about the way forward.
Thank you, Crispin. And Rudy, I'm going to give you a few minutes, let's just say 5, before I hand back to Blessing for questions. There are questions in the Q&A, which we will field to either of Crispin, Shamini, or myself. Rudy, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Deepak. Thanks, Crispin and Shamini and Blessing. Commissioners also. I'll be less than 5 minutes. Safe to say that I think the report is quite an important contribution towards the existing investment plan, and certainly will enhance and improve some of the recommendations that have come out of that. So, safe to say, Crispin, that the president had committed that we follow a proper consultation process, that we put it through the PCC, and I think this has been an invaluable process. South Africa South Africa takes decisions through a consultative process, and this is quite important. For us going forward, what we'll have to do, as I say, is have to consider the recommendations. Much of that is the report in itself is quite pragmatic and provides a number of important areas that would enhance and provide a greater sense of clarity and impact on the investment plan. But as you put it, I think safe to say that I think a lot of it would have to be in the implementation, and that's where the major challenge is always at, right? That we have to work from the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit in ensuring that we mobilize government departments, government entities, civil society, unions, business, various organizations to be able to support the implementation of that investment plan. And I think this is something that requires for us to be able to ensure that it does have that ability, and the ability to mobilize resources for doing that. So I think this has been an absolutely phenomenal and excellent exercise. You've provided really cogent and important contribution towards the investment plan. We have to take that investment plan and, of course, see how we assimilate that in enhancing the report that we have produced during the course of last year. And I think this is going to be an important next step for us going forward. Thank you so much, Crispin and Deepak, Shamini, and Blessing.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rudy. Blessing, should I hand back to you for fielding the questions, including the ones that are in the chat?
Thank you very much, colleagues, for those extensive updates. Yes, I don't see any hands, so we can start in the chat. We've got Lisa Pierce asking about whether there's an intention to use green finance taxonomy criteria for the JET IP. I think Deepak, you should be able to handle that. Then Tara Screamer from Crimea Media has got about 3 questions. What is the status of the JET IP implementation plan? PCC proposing green hydrogen and EVs to be withdrawn from the JET IP, and then given the state of ESCOM and government finance, how does the PCC propose any form of community ownership to be integrated in the investment plan? And then lastly, Brenda Martin has asked if the JET IP is not to be seen and understood as a full South African energy transition plan or in implementation plans, where do these plans reside? And I think that Rudy has tried to answer about the role of other government departments, but maybe colleagues should respond to that. And those that are online that wants to ask verbally could raise their hands too. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you, Blessing. I'll take the question on green taxonomy. As colleagues in the media, as well as other colleagues on this call know, National Treasury has spent a lot of time over the last 2 years developing the green taxonomy. And we would consider that green taxonomy in its current form, but also, as they've indicated, extended to include just transition taxonomy, would be the framework that I think all in the country should utilize for tagging purposes. And I would imagine that as far as assessment against the NDCs are concerned, this would have to be done as well within the framework that the DFFE has provided. I hope that clarifies that question. There is also another question from Alia Kaji with respect to integration into the MTEF. Here, I just want to say, and Crispin might want to add, no, the MTEF is not going to take over the just transition implementation and monitoring. What we're saying, as per the cabinet resolution as it related to the just transition framework, that framework as a whole included, therefore, in that would be the JET IP would have to be looked at in terms of what the fiscal implications are and needs to be covered, especially in those areas that are requiring a fiscal type of facilities and financing. We would want that to be clearly articulated in the MTEF. Crispin, I'll leave the questions from Terence Kramer as well as Brenda Martin to you.
Thank you, Deepak. So just with respect to Brenda's question, when we took the Just Transition Framework we made a recommendation to government around the framework. We presented it to cabinet. Cabinet adopted it as is, but at the time of adopting it, they said we would like to see an implementation plan. So we have commenced work on developing a broader implementation plan for the just transition. Obviously, as the PCC, all we're going to do is make recommendations. So it's not our prerogative to adopt such a plan, but we have been listening very carefully to the various stakeholder conversations. And the next 6 months, we will be putting a more detailed set of recommendations with, clearly defined actions, timeframes, responsibilities, not just for government, but across all of the social partners. That doesn't mean that implementation isn't already happening. I mean, there's actually quite a lot of momentum building up. We had an amazing conference last week, Thursday and Friday, with all the Mpumalanga stakeholders and the Mpumalanga government. There's a lot of momentum building up there around the just transition. So that will, we'll make recommendations within the next 6 months, and it'll be up to cabinet as to it, whether they accept those or not. And what the implementation plan will need to do, certainly from government's perspective, is map out all the different role players that have important roles to play. And that's very wide-ranging. I mean, there's higher education and training with the National Skills Development Plan. There's the Department of Employment and Labour and all the employment incentive schemes. There's DTIC and their various master plans, particularly around renewables energy, new energy vehicles, green hydrogen. There's the role of National Treasury. There's the role of the Department of Transport. The list keeps going on and on. And that's not to mention the important work that provinces and local government have to do. On Terence's questions, so I think that first question is really for Rudy and the team to address. So what's the status of the JET IP implementation plan, and how will this report be reflected in it? I mean, I understand that the PMU is busy with that plan and it's close to finality. Are we proposing that green hydrogen and EVs are dropped from the JET IP? No, not at all. We recognize the important, first of all, with respect to transport. We all focus on the coal value chain and the 100,000 jobs that are locked in there. But, we don't focus nearly enough on the 200,000 workers employed in the auto manufacturing value chains, let alone, the much broader numbers of mechanics and petrol station attendants and a whole lot of other related sectors. So, focusing particularly on the EV transition is important for the sustainability and long-term viability of the auto manufacturing sector. And we do, we note the various concerns that have been raised around green hydrogen, but on our mitigation path, green hydrogen is going to play a vital role, particularly in decarbonizing those hard-to-abate sectors. Iron and steel in particular, agriculture and fertilizers with ammonia. And significantly, it's got, South Africa is well placed to make it into a major economic sector going forward. So we do think there's, clearly we need to do more engagement and work on it. But the message we're saying is that the JET IP can't substitute for the absence of government policy here. And government itself needs to get a move on with finalizing the NEV master plan and the green hydrogen master plan, and clarifying exactly what incentives will come out of the fiscus into those sectors. Given this, and then lastly, Terence asks about the state of Eskom and government financing, and how do we propose that more public or community ownership be integrated into the JET-IP? So it's one of the areas that we focused on. We don't think that the energy sector should only have private models. This is a big concern from Labour and civil society, and we have recommended, and I'm very gratified that it's actually already reflected in the JET-IP, that we should put, we should experiment more and develop proper models of community and worker ownership in the renewable and low carbon energy sector. So we've just launched a project as the PCC to research the sector more, look at models both domestically and internationally, and make detailed proposals around how to start scaling up that sector. There are some very important lessons to learn from the REI 4P program. There's been a very strong community element in that program. We need to take a careful look at it and look at how we can make that work a bit better. Can I hand over to Rudy to talk about the implementation plan and where you're at with that process?
Rupi, I think that's an important question, and Terence, we could not complete the implementation, the implementation plan without the recommendations of the PCC, because that would feed into enhancing the investment plan as well as the implementation plan. Now that we have received that report, we've received a draft some time back, a few weeks ago, but we've now officially received this report as launched by the PCC team. It enables us to be able to move with rapidly in completing that implementation plan, sharing it with different stakeholders, sharing it with our international partner groups, because I think that's important. Everybody has been waiting, but we could not announce an implementation plan until we have completed the stakeholder engagement. And I think that was important. If we did announce it, we would have undermined the process, and I think that's important for us as we move forward. So yes, we will provide as soon as possible an update as to when that would be finalized, but certainly this will feed into finalizing that implementation process as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
And then, Deepak, can I just pick up this question that Sipilele Gludla's put in the Q&A?
Yes, please do that. And if Rudy perhaps is best positioned to answer the question with respect to national ownership of the grid company.
Yeah. So, this term accelerated decommissioning, we pick it up in the report. I think it's an incorrect term. It is linked to the funding that's available from climate investment funds and it's called the accelerated coal transition. That's not what we are recommending. As I said earlier, the least cost pathway is to pull these power stations off at the end of their economic life. It's very difficult to be advocating decommissioning in the middle of a power crisis. And we think there's, moving the decommissioning of particular coal plants out by a couple of years is neither here nor there. And is not going to fundamentally affect our NDC. We are actually making really good progress in terms of emission reductions, partly because of the extent of load shedding and the anemic economic growth that we've been having as a country. So we're already within the NDC range. What we are saying is that once we've stabilized the power crisis, the decommissioning program, should be re-looked at, and we should be opportunistically attempting to, once we've ramped up renewables to a significant degree on the grid, we've got grid stability, we're balancing the grid with adequate peaking power, and we've put co-located batteries in place, then we can look at opportunities to pull those plants off at a slightly faster pace than the end of economic life. So yeah, this idea of an accelerated decommissioning is confusing, and we don't use those words ourselves.
Thank you for that, Crispian. Rudy, there's a question with respect to whether embedded in the JET IP is a certainty that the National Grid Company is in fact going to be publicly or nationally owned. Next question also then relates to the announcement of the debt relief program by the Minister of Finance, and within which is contained a requirement that Eskom is no longer going to be allowed to invest capital expenditure in energy generation. Do you want to handle both those questions, please?
I'm really sorry.
Sorry. Excuse me, Rudy. There is another question from Penny on how much of the grants have started moving in, the grant element of the commitments.
I'm really sorry, colleagues. Just at the time when I'm about to speak, the gardener is busy cutting the hedge over here, so it's a little bit noisy. My apologies. On the first question, as many of you know, the National Transmission Company has finally been set up. It's set up at the end of 2021. It has financially separated and operationally separated. What the National Transmission Company has done is to apply for a license to operate, right? And I think that's important. That's currently being considered by NERSA. It's gone through the public participation process, 3 license applications. That entity would remain as part of the transition plan, a subsidiary of Eskom. Eskom is wholly owned by the state. DPE is its shareholder. That will continue to be like that. And eventually, when the entire Eskom process is complete, where a separate national transmission company is set up, that's not a subsidiary of the Eskom, it will still remain the responsibility and under the ownership of the state. And I think that's very, very important. But that differs substantially around how one thinks through investment if one talks about private sector investment in strengthening and expanding the grid transmission. And as the minister in his budget speech had indicated, including in the JET IP, there are many opportunities and funding flows that would go towards strengthening the transmission and expanding the grid. That is currently being considered. There are various financing options, the possibility of trying to get private sector involvement. That does not impact on the ownership of the grid. The ownership of the grid will always be the state, and whether it's DPE or someone else, it's a different matter, and at some point in time we'll make that decision. And I think that's going to be quite important going forward, as it is right now. Deepak, I'm sorry, man, I got just distracted by this noise over here. I forgot those other 2 questions, if you may just remind me. Sorry, Blessing.
There is one question about the status of the grants, whether any of the grants have started flowing in. Yes.
Yes, it has. In actual fact, some of the policy-based contributions from both France and Germany have already flowed. $300 million each have flowed. Some of the grant funding has flowed. Also, the exercise that we're currently doing, and it's part of a preliminary exercise once we've completed, of course, the consultation process on the investment plan and the finalization of the implementation plan, because I think the partners in themselves have made this very clear. that we need to have quite a detailed, structured implementation plan on where funding will flow. So yes, some of that money has come into South Africa, but at this point in time, monies have not flowed into particular projects until at such time we've completed and finalized an implementation plan that everyone is happy with, including the PCC, I mean, part of the consultation process here, and as well as the international partner group. They're the ones who will have the partnership with at the end of the day.
Thank you, colleagues. I don't see any questions. I don't know whether Commissioner Harrington or Dr. Olva or Deepak, you'd like to just come in. We've got 4 minutes before 11:30. Any closing parts? But as I said to members of the media, I'm available for post-briefing interviews and any other requests for more information for over the weekend stories. Dr. Olva, Shamini, and Deepak. Katrina, there seems to be Katrina with a question that was skipped. Katrina, do you want to go live? Then I don't have to miss it and quickly ask it.
Thank you so much, Blessing. So my question was about kind of given the urgent need for the scale up of renewables, which I think was estimated at 50 to 60 gigawatts by 2030. What is the position of the PCC on the prevention of Eskom's development of new generation capacity itself as part of the 2023 debt restructuring?
Would you like me to respond to that?
Please, Dr. Ola.
So, look, that rollout is going to be a mix of different actors. So, very significantly, government has now enabled municipalities to generate their own power. And a lot of them, certainly the larger metros, are moving at pace to put renewable energy and other low carbon forms of energy onto the grid. Eskom is, in terms of the budget, restricted.